Be set in a comfortable meditation posture and close the eyes. Put your attention on that silence deep in the mind and connect with it. Become the silence. You are the silent witness. From this perspective of higher consciousness, listen to the words of the Yoga Vasishta. Book 4, Chapter 33, continuing with verse 20. Now that we have our passive consciousness of the three worlds, this being the sober truth of the wise, there can be no room for the unrealities of matter and illusion to enter into our belief. This is exactly the statement that now that we are established as the silent witness, this being the sober truth of our life, there can be no room for unrealities of matter and illusion to enter into our belief. The world is whatever wonders are displayed by the active consciousness to the inactive soul. The notion of the world is derived from the rays of the central intellect, stretching to the circumference of understanding. There being no difference between the radiator, the radius, and the circle. We acknowledge the identity of the radiator, the radius, and the circle. The opening and shutting of intellectual eye causes the notions of appearance and disappearance of the world in continued succession. One unacquainted with the true sense of ego is blind within the luminous sphere of consciousness. But he who knows its true meaning finds himself within the sphere of spiritual light and loses himself in the divine light. He who understands divine ego no longer retains any notion of his own ego, but mixes with the Supreme Soul like a drop of water in the waters of the ocean. In reality, there exists no I, or you, or any visible world or anything else. Upon right reasoning, all these blend into the one ego, which remains and exists after all other existences. Even clear understandings are sometimes clouded by false appearances. Like children, seized with fear of demons or ogres. As long as the moonlight of consciousness remains hidden by the darkness of individual ego, the lotus lake of spirituality will not bloom. The feeling of ego being wiped from the mind, the sense of self and selfish passions will vanish of themselves from the heart, and there will be an utter end to fears of death and hell, as also to desires of heaven and liberation. As long as ego feelings float like clouds over the mind, there will be no end to desires growing in the heart like weeds in the plain. As long as the cloud of ego continues to overcast the mind and obscure its consciousness, the humidity of dullness will fill its sphere and prevent the light of consciousness from piercing through it. So what is this ego that appears to be obstructing everything that is real? We understand it to be a cumulative expression of unbalanced individual karmic traces. Until that basis of the ego has been removed, the ego will exist. The ego is like smoke, continually billowing from a pile of burning logs. Until the fire is put out and the logs have been removed, the smoke will continue to rise. The ego will continue to obscure the reality. And the way it obscures it is it blocks full connection with the silent witness. Every time we find the silence in our mind and make that connection, we are looking through the ego to make that connection. That connection cannot be made if we cannot somehow perceive beyond the ego. As we continue to make this connection with the silent witness, we are transcending our collection of individual karmic traces. that transcending will only be permanent, irreversible, when the karmic traces have all been balanced. See, the karmic traces do not lie in an inert mass that we can easily climb over and get beyond and leave them behind. Can't be done. Karmic traces are a vibrating mass, a pulsating mass of energies that have been in our consciousness since their inception, created by our actions that have not been in accord with the divine karmic traces. That's how they're created in the first place. When we transcend beyond these ego-forming karmic traces, this is a very important step. It creates in our consciousness sphere the antidote for karmic traces. There is literally only one technique. Everything else is part of that one technique. The technique for achieving enlightenment is so very simple. It is very easy. It is available to every human being. And the technique is simply striving to connect with and become the silent witness. That's the only technique you need to know. The only step that needs to be taken. All the other techniques, dharana, dhyan, sanyama, trimana sanyama, these are there to help chip away at the karmic traces to allow this one technique of transcending, going beyond the karmic traces, to take place. When we want to go to a destination, first we must have an understanding of where is that destination. What is the direction we must take? Then we look for roads if we're driving our car, because we know our car will go best when it's going on established roads. And we could go off right across the fields and valleys and mountains and through buildings. And maybe someday we might reach it if we have a big enough car. But if we can get on the roads, we're going to get there. These techniques of dharana, dhyan, sanyama, trimana sanyama, these are the roads. We get on those roads, every one of them is going in the direction of the silent witness. so we know we're going to get there. Continuing with verse 32. Ego pride is unmannerly in men. It is taken in the light of vanity. It is the cause of sorrow and not delight. It is like imaginary ghosts to children. The vain assumption of egoism produces a great many errors. It leads to the ambition of gaining an infinity of worlds, as it was in the case of the foolish demons. There is no greater error than the conceit that I am such and such a great man. There will never be a greater error to lead us to utter darkness. This idea, this conceit, I am such and such a great man. This is identification with karmic traces. The greatest error of all. Whatever joy or grief falls upon us at any time in this changing world, it is all the effect of the rotating wheels of ego, turning up and down at every moment. He who weeds and roots out the germs of ego from his heart truly prevents the tree of worldliness from growing out in 100 branches. Belief in the individual ego is the sprout of the trees of our lives in their endless cycles throughout the world. The sense that this is mine is the cause that makes ego expand into 1,000 branches. Our desires and the objects of our desires disappear as swiftly as birds in flight. Upon mature consideration, they prove to be only bubbles, bursting on the fleeting, impermanent waves of our lives. It is because we have no knowledge of the one ego. In this case, the one ego is Krishna. Supreme value of the divine. Supreme level of the silent witness. It is Krishna who is witnessing. It is because we have no knowledge of Krishna that we think ourselves as I, you, this or the other. It is by shutting out our view of Krishna that we see the constant revolutions of this world and that. As long as the darkness of egoism reigns over the wilderness of human life, the goblin of selfishness infests it with its wanton revelry. The vile man, seized by the avaricious demon of selfishness, is at an utter loss to satisfy his needs with any moral precept or spiritual mantra. Ram said, "Tell me, O Venerable Brahmin, how can we suppress our egoism or selfishness and evade the dangers and difficulties in our course through the world?" Vasishtha replied, "It is by seeking to settle the mind in the resplendent soul that shines in the transparent mirror of consciousness. In this way, it is possible for anybody to suppress the sense of personal existence. It is by seeking to establish oneself as the silent witness that shines in the transparent mirror of consciousness. In this way, it is possible for anybody to suppress his sense of personal existence. A close investigation into human life proves it to be a maze full with the false shows of magic. It is not worth loving or hating, and it is not capable of causing our ego pride. He whose soul is free from selfishness, who is devoid of the impressions of phenomena, whose course of life runs in an even course, is the man who can have no sense of ego in him. Now let us continue, established as the silent witness, and begin the Trimana Sanyama practice on the esoteric Mahamantra. To transcend beyond all illusion and become established as Krishna. And in that process, balancing all the karmic traces that have been touched and activated by today's reading. Jai Gurudev.